This is Chris McKaylee, and I'm going to talk about something that might be obvious, but give you some insights on reading a California bill analysis. So, at a minimum, a bill has to go through at least one policy committee in both houses, and then a floor vote in each house. So, at least four analyses. About 80% of the bills are keyed fiscal, meaning that they are required to be re-referred to the Assembly and Senate Appropriations Committees that are the focus of the fiscal impact of legislation. They don't do too much appropriating despite the name. Also, there are times where you could get a dual or even a triple referral. That doesn't refer to policy and fiscal, it refers to policy committee. So sometimes there are bills that are double referred or dual referred, meaning to two policy committees, then a fiscal committee, then the floor. On occasion, it's rare, but on occasion there are triple referrals, three policy committees plus fiscal plus floor. The other thing is that if a bill is amended at all in the second house, the other house, then it has to come back for a concurrence vote in the House of Origin. So an AB that's amended in the Senate comes back for a concurrence vote in the Assembly, and a Senate bill amended in the Assembly returns to the Senate for a concurrence vote. Also, if the bill is substantially amended in the other house, then that bill might get a re-referral under Assembly Rule 77.2 or Senate Rule 29.10 to have another hearing in the policy committee due to those substantial amendments. So I looked at Assembly Bill 1373 by Assemblyman Eduardo Garcia from the 2023 session. I picked floor analysis, policy committee, and a fiscal. The policy committee analysis I picked from the Senate Energy, Utilities, and Communications, EUC. On the Senate side, it went through the Assembly Energy Committee as well. And then for the Appropriations or Fiscal Committee, I picked the Assembly Appropriations Committee. And then I will look at with you the Senate floor analysis and then the Assembly concurrence in Senate amendments, the CSA floor analysis. So the first one is the Senate Policy Committee. And so as you can see, all of them have the committee title on them. This is the Senate Committee on EUC. The chair is Steve Bradford. Of course, they list the 2-year session. And it's important, a couple of things here. Of course, it lists the name, the number of the bill, the author name. The version is key. What is the date of the bill in print that this analysis, that the bill is being analyzed by the committee? And you note here, 8/31/2023 amended. So this is the first amended version in the Senate. It was amended 2 times in the Assembly, and of course it had the introduced version. So it was introduced, amended twice in the Assembly, and now a first time in the Senate. So this is the 4th version of the bill. Here's the hearing date, 9/6. Now some committees list other information. The Senate Energy, many of the Senate committees list whether or not the bill has been keyed fiscal, so it's being re-referred to the Appropriations Committee. This one has an urgency clause at this point that was amended in on the Senate side. And the consultant, some use the initials of the consultant, others list the full name, like the Senate Energy, some list just the last name. Many of the Assembly committees listed on the last page at the very end of the committee analysis. Many Senate committees do it right up here. Then they give the subject, which is often taken, for example, from the relating clause in the title, and then a brief summary. So in the Senate, many of the committees use just a paragraph digest. Other committees, such as the Assembly Judiciary Committees, often spends the rest of the first page writing its little executive summary, if you will, of the provisions of the bill. And then every committee, policy committee analysis is going to begin with what is existing law. And so This analysis begins on page 1 with the existing law and ends at the top of page 4, and then every committee analysis in this, including this one, begins next with this bill. So this bill defines, this phrase requires the PUC, etc. So again, the next part of the analysis is going to explain what this bill does. Now, some committee analyses then go on to list, many of them provide just a paragraph or so to the author. So this is the author's statement in support of their bill. Some committees then go into a discussion of the proponents and opponents' arguments. Others do not. They often offer comments, including suggested amendments. So all the way on page 16, the Senate Policy Committee here has listed two types of amendments. One is a technical one. So they reference that Section 8 of the bill in this Public Utilities Code section needs to have an updated reference to the definition of eligible energy resources. And then their last comment, comment 4, is they're actually suggesting that a particular section of the water code get a definition of the term construction, and then they give their definition of it. And what you'll often hear is a committee chair at the beginning or ending of the author's presentation. Do you accept the committee's amendments? And they'll reference them. For example, amendments 3 and 4 on page 16 of our analysis. Do you, assembly member, accept those as author's amendments? Then a number of committees, especially on the Senate side, but the Assembly side as well, often list prior related legislation and any one related bills that are pending in the current legislation. And then they'll often go on to list supporters and opponents. Some give a couple of paragraphs or just one paragraph to the supporters and one to the opponents, and then they conclude. So the next committee analysis, again, the fiscal one, and I chose the Assembly, I chose a Senate Policy Committee, and here I'm picking the Assembly Fiscal Committee. This is the Appropriations Committee. And as you can see again, it's got the committee name, Chris Holden, Chair, AB 1373, the author's name, and look, as amended April 13th. So remember, the analysis is telling you the version of the bill that's being analyzed by the committee. And of course, here they list right up top, this is the hearing date. Appropriations, for example, and a number of policy committees meet every single week. So they always have the date of the hearing. They also note which policy committee it went through. So Assembly Appropriations notes that this bill went through Assembly Utilities and Energy Committee. And then some committees list one or more of the Legislative Council's digest keys. So here, urgency. Now remember, Senate side, Senate Energy, it said yes. And that's because in that first set of amendments in the Senate, they actually added an urgency. So when the bill was going through the Assembly, it did not have an urgency clause. So that's why it says no. The next one is, does it have a state mandated local program? Here it says yes. And then for the fiscal committee analysis, it's important to know, is it reimbursable or not? Because obviously that has cost implications to the state. In other words, because they're mandating local agencies to do a particular program pursuant to state law, the state is obligated to reimburse those local agencies for those costs. And here the bill undoubtedly has a disclaimer, meaning despite there being increased costs to local agencies, the state's not going to reimburse them. Then they get into a summary. This is a couple of paragraphs, an opening short and then two lengthy ones. And then, of course, the most critical component here, which is what is the fiscal impact? And then generally both appropriations committees, again, the fiscal committees of the Senate and the Assembly, go into a set of comments. Neither appropriations committees, meaning neither the fiscal committees, list supporters and opponents in their bill analyses. It's just a summary and what is the fiscal impact. Where do they get the fiscal impact? They get those from the relevant state departments or agencies, the folks who have to implement this bill if enacted, or that they're impacted by it, for example, or it requires them to do something, those departments and agencies give a fiscal analysis to the fiscal committee staff, and that is, of course, reflected in this analysis. Next up is a floor analysis. This is the Senate one. And you can see third reading. It's on third reading, the third and final reading of a bill. The Senate floor analyses are prepared by the Office of Senate Floor Analyses, which is under the Senate Rules Committee. And of course, it lists the bill and the author, the version. September 7th is the version. It has the vote requirement right here. Because it has an urgency clause, it requires that supermajority vote, which is 2/3. And then, like the other floor analyses, it lists what happened in the Senate. So it went through Senate Energy, passed 14-3. Here are the aye votes and the no votes. Then it went to Senate Appropriations Committee. It passed 5-2. And then what's the subject? Who's the sponsor? Here the author is the sponsor. Maybe there was an interest group that was the sponsor or a constituent. They're listed there. And then that short digest paragraph. And then, of course, it gets into a discussion of what is existing law? What does this bill propose to do? They also reference in the Senate analysis some of those related current year bills that are on the same topic, or else bills from prior sessions. They have basically taken the language out of the Senate appropriations, the fiscal committee analysis here, and replicated it in the floor analysis. And at the conclusion, the Senate floor analysis unit verifies supporters, the opponents, these four, and then it gives a long paragraph to some arguments, not all of them, of course, but some of the main arguments in support, and then arguments, of course, in opposition at the top of the last page. And then they give the assembly floor votes, and so that the members of the Senate can see that. The last analysis for this bill is the CSA, it's called on the Assembly side, concurrence in Senate amendments. Of course, the Senate has the CAA, concurrence in Assembly amendments. So here's what the Assembly floor, this is not a third reading analysis, this is a concurrence analysis of the final one. And obviously it's titled the CSA, concurrence in Senate amendments. Again, the bill, number and author, the amended date. So this is not the same date as when it passed the Assembly, because now it's back on concurrence and it was amended twice in the Senate. And so there it is, amended September 7th. They note, of course, whether it's majority or 2/3 or something else. And why is it 2/3? Because of the urgency. They provide a summary, and then they get right into how did the Senate change it. So here's a list of all the Senate amendments that were made, 11 in total on the first page, goes on to the second page, and the Senate floor analysis does the same. Then they get into a list of comments, okay? Sometimes those comments are just background based upon the supporters and opponents. And on this analysis, the CSA, they give a lengthy paragraph to the argument of the author of the bill. And then they list the arguments in support and the arguments in opposition to the bill. They'll pick somebody. They pulled just a little bit, what is the fiscal analysis? And they pulled the most recent analysis from the Senate because the bill was substantially amended in the Senate. And so the Assembly appropriations fiscal analysis is no longer relevant or up to date. So they quote the Senate one. And then, of course, what were the votes when the bill went through the Assembly? So here's the policy committee, the fiscal committee, and then the floor vote, and who did it so that that person can be uh, uh, contacted if anything, you have any questions, etc. What do you notice from the Senate and Assembly? The Senate on their floor analyses lists supporters and opponents. The Assembly on their floor analyses do not list proponents and opponents of a bill. Okay, so this is not an exhaustive look, but this is basically what you're looking for and how to review policy, fiscal, and floor analyses in the California State Legislature. I hope this has been a helpful overview.